all up her pontificating about something.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Death of Superman panel. We got any fans of the book? Yeah, that could be a little better, guys. Let's bring it up for these guys. Now we're talking. So let me introduce Mr. Dan Jurgens and Brett Breeding. I told you backstage I was geeking out because that comic to me was what I was 9 years old and reading that book each week, and it just meant so much to me. And I just got to thank you for that because that was my comic growing up.
You are welcome. We did it just for you too. Yeah,
I knew that. That's what I was thinking. But I want to ask what was the climate like in the industry at the time? Because a lot of people say comics now do these stunts to sell books. But to me, it was just like you were just trying to make a great story.
and that's what we were trying to do. And we had started to build this idea of how we would do connected stories across what at that time was the 4 Superman titles. And we had done a couple of efforts like that. Earlier, we had done it when there were 3 books. We had done it when there were 2 books. And we had kind of gotten to the point where we perfected that technique that we could tell a bigger story across all 4 titles. And when we did The Death of Superman, we were often accused of doing it as part of a marketing scheme or something like that. And it wasn't that. We were just trying to tell a good, rollicking, adventurous story that would then be followed up by the pathos of a world without Superman. And it was all about the story.
No, when I started on Superman, there were only 3 books, and it was almost like a loss leader for DC. And they didn't do trade paperbacks, and Superman was their main flagship title. But so we were kind of left alone to do what we wanted to do. We weren't driven, with any directive on, to do certain things. We didn't think they would let us do this story, killing Superman, the cash cow, So it all came out of left field, the response. And then when we started getting more attention, we finally, all the work we had been doing for those years was starting to pay off, because we were making Superman popular again with the fans, which wasn't necessarily the case beforehand.
I want to ask too, because recently in comics at Marvel, Spider-Man was killed, and I heard the writer of that got a bunch of death threats. Did anything happen like that when the news broke?
There were threats. I don't know that we ever really took them seriously. I know that at one point, and our editor was Mike Carlin, and I know he and I were approached by a bodyguard protection service or 2. But, we got angry phone calls, we got angry letters. Email didn't really exist, fortunately. The web barely existed. So I think that there was that sense of outrage more in the general public than in comic fandom. I think comic fans sort of understood this is the kind of thing that comics do, right? They tell a story like that and the hero dies or whatever. And I think it was portrayed differently to, for the lack of a better term, the general population. And some of those people got upset and there were angry columns, but nothing that I took seriously.
I want to mention too, if anybody has any questions, we have a microphone here if you want to start lining up. I heard as well, Dan, that you didn't want Superman to come back.
That I didn't want him to come back? No. We always wanted Superman to come back. I think that what you may have heard, we didn't know how he was going to come back or exactly when. We knew we would probably do something built around Adventures of Superman 500. But if you remember, we stopped publishing the Superman titles for a while, and we did other things. There was a magazine effort called News Time, and there were other specials, and we had stopped publishing the books. So when we did it all, we didn't know exactly how or when he was coming back, but especially emphasis on we didn't know how.
And the two of you like to collaborate together. A, how did you first get in touch with each other? And B, just what makes you keep coming back to working together?
What was the first thing we did?
There was Adventures of Superman.
I think so.
That you did 4 issues on right after I was working with Kerry Gamble on Superman. And I think those were fill-ins that you had done because I was just getting ready to start a run with George Perez on Action, which is why I had been hired on the Superman books. But from the time I was hired, it took a year for that to get up running. So I spent that year doing a handful of stories of Superman with Kerry Gamble, and then I think 3 or 4 issues of Adventures
That's
with
right.
you.
Yeah.
And then I went back with George, and then George and Kerry, and then I did a run on Action with Kerry. And right as they got to the issue where Superman reveals himself to Lois, Mike Carlin called me and said, I want to move you over to, I forget which title it was. I don't remember if it was Superman at that point.
That was Adventures.
Adventures,
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
right.
that was Adventures.
Over Dan.
Yeah.
And I was like, this is going to be like a big deal. And he says, nah, the engagement was the big deal. That's not, nobody's going to notice. I need you over there. So that's when I got moved on to Dan regularly at that point. And
yeah, and we had kind of bounced through the George Perez thing because you were going to be finishing George
Right.
as he penciled, but at the same time, George was writing the book that I was drawing, and that didn't last long. It turned out to be a little too much for George, so he moved on, and that's when we also had a shakeup.
yeah.
What makes you work so well together?
I think stylistically, we are a good match, and you can't say that about everybody. But I think that, like, Brett's ink line has a boldness to it. A lot of inkers tend to work either bold or they work fine, and you're someone who bounces back and forth, where you understand the impact of a heavy line and the sensitivity of something thinner, which I appreciate.
Yeah, I mean, it was a work in progress too, because I think for both of us, Dan's work evolved from the first issues we did. If you go back and look at those early Adventures issues, my inking is different. Dan's penciling was different than what it turned out, in later years. And I think it really was an evolution for both of us, finding, what worked best for us, and then figuring out what worked best together. And I'd like to say I knew what I was doing, but I was really kind of stumbling into it, using my influences that I thought, like Dick Giordano was an influence and had done some great stuff on Dan, and Klaus was an influence, and I just thought that was a style that if I could work towards. So at one point I changed up the tools. I stopped using a pen as much and started using a brush, which allows you to go bolder. And it just kind of came together, and everybody seemed to like it.
Yeah.
I mean, the fans, but the people we were working for too really liked the finished product. So that's kind of how it happened.
Speaking of influences, who were some of your other kind of influences as to getting into comics in the first place?
For me, John Buscema was the whole reason I wanted to be in comics. I fell in love as a kid with his Avengers run with Tom Palmer back in the 60s. And that was when I realized, boy, I want to do this. This stuff's great. And he's been like the longest lasting influence. I wish I drew like him, but I'm always trying to. Other than that, I always thought I'd break into comics as a penciler, but I started working right out of high school as Bob Layton's background assistant on his run of Iron Man. So I came into the business as an inker, and Bob being a Finnish inker, working on breakdowns and stuff was, something that worked for me, that I liked, because you got to contribute a little more. And it just kind of evolved from there. I ended up staying with the inking, and Bob was an early influence, but the ones that have stuck with me have been like Tom Palmer, Klaus Janson, Dick Giordano, Joe Sinnott's in there a little bit. So I'm kind of a mutt when it comes, of influences.
We all are. I've always said that you're influenced by anything you look at. And in a lot of cases, I think what Brett was citing was the idea of the stuff you see that inspires you to go in a certain direction.
Yeah.
You also get influenced by stuff you look at and say, this doesn't work for me, and I'm not going down that road or that road or that road. So we are all mutts to a certain degree and influenced by everything we've ever seen.
Kind of touching on that too, I mean, I'm sure there's some really famous artists and writers that have been influenced by you. Do you have any stories of people that have come up to you that...
I find that to be the hardest notion to wrap my brain around, because I study like Klaus's work and Tom Palmer's work and Dick's work. When I was working, I would be looking at things, and then I'd go sit at the drawing board, and I wouldn't look at it and copy it, but I would like absorb it. And they all had a distinct style to me. And I look at me even now, and I'm kind of a chameleon to try to serve the penciler I'm working with, but I don't think I have a definitive style that someone can copy or emulate like my influences. And I do have people come up and say, I've been an influence on their work, and I just find that so hard to believe because my work is so derivative of other people, and that what are they seeing in my, so it's a compliment, but it is one that's very hard for me to wrap my brain around.
It is always a surprise, and it's very flattering, and it exists on a lot of different levels. Some of it artistically, some of it as a writer, some of it just conceptually, or it's someone who said, this story is kind of a tribute to you because of these 8 issues of something you did 25, 30 years ago, and you go, well, gee, thanks. And I never know what to say in a way. It's always very flattering.
And the thing about the death of Superman at the time, to me personally, it felt like there was a tonal shift in comics going. Like it was around the time of the Broken Bat stuff, Wolverine losing his adamantium to Magneto, and the only other superhero I could think of that was like, you see these people becoming having humanistic qualities, and they're really like hurting. Like the only one I could think of before that was like Iron Man with his alcoholism. What was going on?
Well, I think there were a lot of things that were happening in comics at that time, and as much as anything, I think what we were being able to do is explore different dimensions of the character that hadn't been explored before. Had there been a Death of Superman story done before? Yes. But what I think we were exploring more was what happens to the world without Superman in it. That after you got through the Death of Superman story itself, that's what we wanted to explore. What do you say about the character during their absence? Because, that's when, let's face it, when someone dies, that's when everybody starts talking and saying nice things about them. And that's what we wanted to do. In terms of comics at the same time, Image Comics had started up right around that point as well. And certainly there was an influence on the marketplace then. We had already planned the Death of Superman, but I think comic book marketing was changing at the same time as well. And if you look at how all of a sudden comics were being handled with cover enhancements, and for us, the bagged edition of Superman 75, that influenced it. So it was a combination, and I apologize for the long answer, but it's a combination of what you want to do as a writer and the story you want to tell, as well as the way the business and marketing were changing around it.
Well, one of the things that I noticed was the day the book came out, there was a lot of media coverage, and I was in the Philadelphia area, and there was a guy from Fox News that, he had inside information that we had planned this, and he knew Paul Levitz, and he says, you guys know you're bringing it back. You just did this as a ploy, which was the furthest thing from the truth. We had no idea. We didn't think they would let us do it, and it was like, but then when it exploded, then everyone was there was a sense of, we need to recreate this. What can we do? Let's do a foil cover. Let's do this. And marketing, I think, took over that, well, we can do big things with Superman. And they tried to kind of, the tail tried to wag the dog there for a while.
Right.
And that was like one of the negative aspects of it. But again, it was because we now made Superman a viable property they could market. They knew they could put him out there and people would buy it.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I personally feel like this book was the last great shock in comics, because now it seems like there'll be a press release like a month before when some character dies or something. This was the one that I was reading, and it hit me as I was reading it, and that was kind of cool because I saw, when Captain America died, it was in the New York Times before the book came out.
Right.
So, any thoughts on that?
Well, one of the things that's so different now is the way that back then books would sort of more just come out, and now they're solicited. And so much of it is the more you can say about a book in solicitations, the more you might be likely to sell. The big one we were able to pull off back then, I think, was the return of Superman, because what no one saw coming was the idea that 4 different characters would show up, one in each of the titles, and essentially claim to be Superman brought back to life. If we were doing that same story today, all of that would have been known 3 months before the books were actually published.
Yeah.
There's no way you could keep that secret now. And I think for me, as I look back at it, one of the coolest aspects of all of that was when everyone was trying to guess, how are they going to bring Superman back? When we came out with the 4 characters, no one saw that coming. It absolutely took everybody by surprise, and now that's impossible.
Well, the day again that the book came out, everyone was like, "Well, you killed him, and you know he's coming back. You didn't really do this." And my response was, "Well, that we don't know. It's just to think that a character that's on peanut butter and underwear and is the biggest recognized icon in the world is not coming back is ridiculous. But we have no idea how that's going to happen. And the point is, it's not about the death like it is when so many characters die. Everybody says, oh, Dr. Doom's dead. He's coming back, right? Well, yeah, we kind of knew in some form or fashion Superman would come back. The important thing was the story that followed, how the world reacted to Superman being gone, and those were the really fun stories. And I think that was what made them different than every other character that dies, is the aftermath. Because Superman, in the world of comics, but in the real world, is such a big deal. So.
I mean, speaking of that, Funeral for a Friend was just such a wonderful storyline. I distinctly remember seeing that for the first time and just seeing all my favorite superheroes, and there's all this color, but there was also the darkness being at a funeral. Where did that all come about, where you realized you were going to bring all the superheroes into the story at this time?
Well, once we made the decision that we were going to kill him, it's weird. More and more as we talked about Superman's death, we were talking about the Funeral for a Friend storyline without even knowing that that's what it was going to be. And we'd be saying things like, oh, and then they'd have a funeral and Ma and Pa can't even go because then the world would, stuff like that. And then we'd get back to talking about the death of Superman, and eventually we realized that what interested us more was the Funeral for a Friend thing. And, it was the idea that we drew straight from the JFK funeral to have the cortege and everything else and that kind of scene, and have the president address it. And then, well, of course, all the heroes have to come out. And of course, they'll carry the casket and everything. And that's really, as I recall, that's what we had. We were more interested in discussing that in some ways than the death itself.
Well, it was also a way of exploring the character of Superman.
Right.
In a way you couldn't before, because you now had a vehicle to explore him through everybody else's eyes and what he meant to, his mom and pa couldn't be at the funeral. Imagine that. You couldn't go to your own child's funeral. What he meant to the world of those characters in comics, but also the readers. It's like, wow, is he really gone? Is he, Well, it was a totally different perspective than anything we'd done before.
And to just jump in, the other part of it was, we were also aware of the fact that we were killing 2 characters. We were killing Superman and Clark Kent. So then what do? And as soon as you mention Clark Kent, then he and Lois are engaged. And like you mentioned, his parents out in Smallville and everything else. And that's what became really interesting to explore. And I have always thought one of the nicest things was that, so Superman dies in Superman 75. And right around that time, there were a number of columnists on a national level who would write a column based on, what does it say about the world that we don't have a Superman? And then our issues that came out right after that would be dealing with that exact same storyline. And I thought that was just this nice duality of history and fiction. And that's why, to get back to your question from earlier, there will never be anything like that in comics again. It just won't happen, because no matter how hard you try and do it, lightning doesn't strike twice.
And you mentioned from a marketing perspective, like the foil covers and whatever. I remember buying, I think, 12 copies of the issue in the bag, and then I opened 2 of them and put one of the armbands I wore to school all week. Like, where did that even come from? Because I don't remember it going to that length at the time before.
What do you mean?
The little, having the little bags with the little.
That was that was not us. That's where DC marketing really did step up, and I think they were responding to sort of the market at the time, because I distinctly remember right after our meeting where we had planned all that, sitting down with someone in DC sales at the time. We were explaining to him. We said, we're going to do this thing called the death of Superman, blah blah blah, and he said, so what? He didn't see the potential. but they really drove it home when they said, we'll do the black bag, we'll put a poster in it, we'll do an armband. And I remember when they were telling me about it, I was just like, really?
Yeah.
Wow, that's great. I couldn't get over that they were going to try and do all of that, and it was fantastic. It really helped drive home the event.
Yeah, we just figured it was going to be a regular book out on the stand and a larger size issue, but we weren't aware of any of the stuff until they started actually working on it.
Yeah, and here's what you all need to mention to DC. If you ever see anyone from DC, and yeah, tell Dan DiDio I sent you. Which is in all the, okay, so if you look at the real edition of Superman 75, it ends with a 3-page fold-out. It goes from single splash pages to a double page, and then Superman falls back and he's dead at Lois's, and it's a triple-page spread. And even in their omnibus editions, they have never reprinted it that way, and it makes me crazy. So we have to start that campaign.
Any reason for that, or
Cost. Just, yeah, I got it. Cost in general. It's just one of those things that it costs money to put it back. And what I find now is a lot of the people who work on putting it together, they don't even look at the original material. They look at previous trade paperbacks and such, so they don't even know it exists.
obviously I have to ask about Doomsday because you created him. I heard it said you created him because you were sick of all the villains talking so much.
What I had was an idea that just said, you know, all of Superman's villains are talky, non-powered guys. And they were like Lex Luthor, who was a basic criminal with no powers, and Toyman, and the list goes on. And I just was desperate to draw a big knockdown brawl. And at that point, there wasn't a name like Doomsday. I just said, I want to do a beast. Just a beast that tears up Metropolis. And that's kind of the seed of the idea.
And another thing I saw, that because I was reading the comic, you know, every week, there was the 4 issues before that run started where it was just the last page was Doomsday's fist going through a wall, and then it starts cracking, and it's like Doomsday's coming, Doomsday's here. I've never really seen a comic like that before either. I'm wondering where that kind of came from.
You just addressed this recently, so take it.
Well, I don't know about the punching the fist. I think that came out of the meetings because we had these Superman summits where we're trying to build to it. But that ultimately led to the idea I suggested where, and some people may not even be aware of this, but the 4 issues of leading up to the death of Superman, we compressed the story by reducing the panels. We started with 4 panels a page, and then 3 panels, then 2, and then the death of Superman were all splash pages. And the idea was to, you know, compress that down and create momentum going into the, you know, final story. And some of that came out of the idea that whoever, I really don't know whose specific idea it was, but the pounding was just kind of that. I think they were even an extra page added on. It was kind of like a drum beat. That was, I do kind of remember that. Let's have this drum beat of just boom.
You know,
boom,
what I remember,
build.
what I remember of that is Walter Simonson had done a couple issues of Thor where there was a looming threat that was coming, and it was like doom, doom.
Oh,
doom.
You know what? Yes,
And
I
that
kind of
was the
remember
drum
that.
beat. And we were talking about that, and of course, his wife Louise was one of our writers, and she was in the room when we were talking about how great that was because it just started to build anticipation.
Yeah.
And we totally ripped that off. And I mean, we just totally and completely stole that idea because of what Walter had done on Thor.
Yeah, I kind of remember that.
But don't quote me on that.
That's great. We have a question over here.
Hello?
Hello?
Okay, well Dan, we talked earlier, it's a couple of hours ago, I mentioned that The Death of Superman was my first comic book, the trade paperback. Also, I didn't mention I'm from Venezuela, and it made it to the national news. I mean, in the national newspaper, Sunday edition, The Death of Superman is the only comic book story I ever seen there. So it was great. And well, my question is, did you guys plan for Cyber Superman or the Eradicator to be villains from the start, or you were more, I don't know, you were planning on having one of those be actual Superman or the successor of Superman?
Well, what had happened is we had done the Death of Superman, or we're in the midst of it. We were done working on the death of and the return of, or Funeral for a Friend. And we got together in a meeting and we said, okay, now we have to bring Superman back. How are we going to do it? What is he? What is the mechanism? And we went through different ideas. And finally, you know, my recollection is Wheezy during the meeting, because we all had different ideas. Each creative team kind of had their own idea. And Wheezy said, oh, why can't we just do all four? It's too bad we can't, or something to that effect. And we started to kick that around. And that's when we came up with the idea of a Superboy and the Eradicator and Steel. And as part of that, I remember saying, well, you know what'd be cool? If we do one of them that turns out to be a villain, because you know, bad guys in real life never come out and say, hi, I'm the bad guy, I'm here to destroy your life, right? They come out and they try and act like the good guy. So we started, I just said, well, I want to do the bad guy, whoever it is, and then we hit on Cyborg Superman, and that's when we planned it. So that was planned during the idea of coming back with 4 different characters.
Great, thank you.
So I assume your favorite of the 4 is Cyborg because you created him. Do you have a favorite of the 4?
No. I mean, I inked Cyborg the most, and of course, he was probably the hardest of the 4
Yeah.
to ink.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it was fun. You know, I got to draw from my old Bob Layton Iron Man metal technique for it.
Right. Well, what Brett and I used to talk about during that time is, it's like we realized pretty quickly, geez, all those other characters are going to get their own books. Our guy dies. What the hell?
I wanted to ask too, I mean, is there anything you'd wanted to, since it was such a success, is there anything you would have wanted to do differently in hindsight?
I wish I would have documented more of it in retrospect. I don't know how I would have necessarily done that, because it's not like, I wish we had today's tech back then, because it would have been fun to have an iPhone. Yeah, exactly. Because it's hard to explain now what it was like then. People don't realize it unless they were there. And I wish there would have been, I would have made more of an effort to document everything. Brett had an early generation video camera back then. And
some of the early meetings I have
Right.
documented, not the ones that pertain to Death of Superman,
yeah.
but we didn't know what we were working on at the
Right.
time. It was just another round of stories.
Yep. And I just told Brett today, I wish we would have saved the art.
Yeah.
I want to ask too, another really iconic image is obviously the thing where it's like there's the stick in the ground and the cape just flying from it. Where did that come from?
That
was-
all from Dan, I would imagine.
We went through a bunch of, I think I did like 5 or 6 cover designs for Superman 75. And whenever I do cover designs and cover sketches, I always have one in there that I want to do and one that I feel like there's no way they're going to pick it. And when I did the sketch with the cape, I kind of thought, gee, that could be kind of cool. And there's no way they'll ever pick it. And they went for it, which surprised me. And I think it's cool because it is still so unique. It's its own iconic image. But so the funny thing is this. One time I was at about 5 years ago, I was at a DC presentation for all its freelancers on cover design and stuff like that. And they actually put that slide up on the wall, and I'm sitting there going, well, this will be interesting. And the person giving the presentation said, you know, this is the kind of cover we would never do again. We would never do this today. And I thought, really saying that with me sitting here? But yeah, it was at the moment. They made the right choice, and it still holds up.
And I mean, being such a like influential book, you as an artist and writer, how did you juggle both roles?
I have always seen it as one job, that I think of myself as a storyteller and not just a writer or just an artist. I'm telling a story. And part of it is, even as I draw, I will make changes to the story as I work, because it's, to me, not I write it and then I draw it. It's more like a continual evolving project somehow. And so I just see it, I see that as the natural way to working. So as writers have said, you know, how do you approach it? In a way, the response to me is, well, you should learn how to draw it, because, you know, it becomes a lot easier. But to me, it's just one process.
And I mean, obviously we'll talk about the film, but I guess the first incarnation of the live action was Smallville with Doomsday.
Live action, yeah.
What was it like seeing that for the first time? That's got to be a blast.
It was. It's with any character you design, it's always interesting to see how they translate to whatever else it is, whether it's animation, live action, or whatever. And what I thought was interesting about Smallville is they obviously had a very limited budget. It was basically a guy in a rubber suit, and whenever they filmed it, there was a lot of smoke, things like that.
A lot of shadow.
Because they did what they could with it, and you'd only get a short glimpse of them. But given the realities of what they had to work with, and budget-wise, and lack of available CGI at that time, I thought it was a pretty credible effort.
Yeah, I thought they did a really good, with the limitations that they had.
Yeah.
They presented it in a really cool way.
Did they come to you for any advice or anything?
No. It was just all of a sudden there. Yeah.
And let's talk about the film too. It's got to be crazy seeing your character you created on the big screen too.
It is, well, to step back from that, it was fun because years ago there was an effort where Tim Burton was going to do the Death of Superman on film. And at that time, the Doomsday designs they were pursuing looked nothing like ours.
Oh,
it was like a giant insect.
Yeah, it was like something with tentacles and
it was
this really weird alien-looking thing. Yeah.
It was like nothing that we did, or a giant spider or something.
Yeah,
like
yeah.
That. So to get to, and I dreaded that. I can't sit through that movie. I hope they don't make it. Pardon me. So when they finally, when they finally got to the point where they did this version, and to see 85–90% of the character that way, I take that as a win.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, there's, if you only pay attention to the negative aspects of the things that didn't work, I mean, there's a lot of things like, why didn't they do this? Or when you take what they did and you try to look at it from the positive side, to bring the character at all and scrunch him into another movie and, really compress that big storyline into the way they did it, I wasn't embarrassed by it. I wish they had done it differently, but with what they did, I mean, I thought that it came across the sacrifice of Superman when he was, grabbing the spear, and the connection between him and Lois, and the realization that this was a sacrifice he was making. I thought that came across really well and was one of the better points of the movie for me. I wish Doomsday looked more like Doomsday.
With the...
the
protrusions,
more bony protrusions, and even a pair of pants, or something. But something, I thought he looked a little silly rather than menacing. So, if you dwell on the negatives, there's a lot of them there. But I think there's also some positive stuff that I was happy to see.
The other part of that is, and it was cool to see your creation on the screen. That's part of it. But what's also flattering is when they took scenes that we had drawn, like where Lois is holding Superman and all that stuff, and obviously used the book and tried to recreate essentially what we drew. That was tremendously flattering. And you just sit there going, it's not just the character, they're trying to mimic what we did. And I thought that was really cool.
And touching on the Tim Burton film, I mean, even though Doomsday didn't seem to look like Doomsday at all, they seem to try to make Nick Cage's character seemingly like a couple of the, I mean, with the long hair and the blue. Can you kind of talk a little on that?
It would have been interesting to see how they handled it. We saw, we've all seen now, some of what they flirted with on it. I don't know if it would have worked or not. Ideally, somewhere there's an alternate universe where we can go one day and see the film and then make the decision. But it was, I have this weird reaction to it because obviously they were using the story as source material, but then it looked like when it came to Doomsday, they were ignoring everything we did. So I wouldn't have had a lot of faith that was necessarily going to make the leap.
And I've been asking everyone this throughout the weekend, but what advice would you give to budding creators to make a project of this magnitude? I know you can't prepare for a project like that, but what advice would you give when you're in the middle of something like that?
I mean, you mean just comics in general, or
comics in general, or if you're in such a huge whirlpool of a big thing going on?
I'd say go to college and get a real job. Comics is such a different business these days that I really can't find myself encouraging anyone to go into it. But creatively, if that's what somebody wants to do, you try to prepare them for the realities of it and just say, you got to just give it your best shot and never become complacent with the work you're doing. I see a lot of guys whose work looks just like it did 20 years ago. They're just cruising along. And the people that still kind of get me going are the guys that are still looking for the new ways of doing things. They're still reinventing themselves all the time. And open your mind to everything that's out there. Dan mentioned something earlier about when you're looking at other people's influences, but also looking at the things that you don't like. Well, sometimes when you look at things that aren't within the influences that you like, you find things you go, wow, I don't do that. I kind of, your mind opens up to different ways of approaching things. Just don't stay settled in one way, and try to be versatile. If anything, I think versatility in this business will help with longevity in this business, Be able to do more than one thing. Just don't be a pencil or a writer or an inker, Try to do a lot and understand, all the different aspects, and hopefully that will lead you to a long career.
That's great. Dan, anything you want to say?
I think Brett is right. But to me, it doesn't matter if it's comics or what it is. I think we live in a society, in a world where things move and change at a much faster pace now, and it's always about having options. Very simply, it's have options. Make yourself flexible and adaptable, and be willing to do so. And the one thing I always tell people, and I think this extends more to writers probably, but it's be willing to listen. The thing I see is when I find people who are unwilling to listen, then I can't work with them. And you have to be willing to listen, because that's the only way you learn.
And it's funny, as you were saying this, it kind of made me realize, if this book had come out now with the internet, the only thing I can compare this to is like recently is the Cap Hydra stuff, where just people are on Twitter just nailing the writer and saying positive and negative things. What do you think it would have been like if the internet had been around while you were making this book?
In general, my guess would be it would have been a negative impact on the book, and I think that is because I find social media to be largely negative anyway. That if you tend to look at, basically social media is a place where people who would never dare say that to your face standing in front of your table will certainly get online and say it over and over and over again and cause a disproportionate effect. So it would be hard for me to look at it and say it would have been a positive.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that, because it gives everybody a voice, and so much of what you see is negative. And with the movies and the movie universes, I'm constantly seeing people going at each other over Marvel versus DC, and I'm like, why can't it be Marvel and DC? I want to see all these heroes done as well as they can be done.
Yep.
I want to see a Justice League movie that's as good as the Avengers movie. I want to see a Marvel television show that's as good as some of the stuff DC's putting on TV. Why has it got to be one or the other? And I think the internet is one of the things that fuels that negative aspect, that competition. It's like, Chevy versus Ford or Pepsi versus Coke. Why has it got to be Marvel versus DC? Let's have them all do great.
So do you think the internet's had a negative aspect on the creative process from a...
I think the loudest voices on the internet are the negative voices.
That's fair, yeah.
And that's the problem with it. It's that they drown everybody else out. And you will find people that have good things to say, that and I do this. If I go somewhere and there's something I want to say on somebody's thread, if there's a lot of negativity, I just keep my mouth shut and move on. So the people that are getting the voice are the people that are voicing the negative stuff. And the reasonable people, tend to just be quiet and move on.
I think, and I don't even try and refer to it as the internet, because I think the reality is then we make it a monolithic thing, and it is not. It is people. And what I find is the rancor and bitterness and the method of expression from those people. It does have a negative effect overall. We have seen that in the industry just within the past year or so, as it was directed to certain people within the industry. And overall, it's really unfortunate, but it's always important to remember that there are people behind those comments. And I think they're probably trying to make up for something else in their lives, perhaps. It's not upon me to guess, but overall, it has had, I think, a negative impact and one that's only going to increase.
And finally, to wrap up, what's been? Can you name one like great moment that you had during the process of creating the Death of Superman story, or post with a fan, or anything you want to share?
Well, I think one of the coolest things that happened to me, it was kind of an eye-opener, was 6 or 7 months, the July after the Death of Superman came out, my wife and I went and did a vacation in the Galapagos Islands. We were on a small boat with 16 people, 18 crew members, and the first night they sit everybody down, all the guests, and you go around and you introduce yourself. And there were 2 doctors and their wives, and a lady that was a manager of one of the biggest hotels in New York City, and a postal worker. And David Michelinie was with us, who was writing Spider-Man at the time. And my wife worked for a big bank in insurance, and then I was drawing Superman. And of course, when you tell people, what we do, that draws attention. Well, some of the crew had heard this, and they had some of our comic books, Death of Superman comic books, on that boat in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. That was like the most surreal thing to realize. You hear how the Superman symbol is like the second most recognized icon in the world, next to the Christian cross.
Wow.
I've heard this a lot. Well, that kind of drove that home, because look where I am, and here's my work is on this ship. What are the chances of that? And that's how big Superman, it's not me. They didn't buy them because of me. They bought it because it was Superman. And that was like really, really cool to see just how big a deal he was.
That's great. Dan?
This is going to sound corny, and I apologize for that.
Are we recording it?
I think so.
At the time, I'm going to cheat on the question. Before we came up on stage, one of the comments I made is, gee, I don't know if I need to answer any other questions about Superman 75. The reality of it, however, is this. It is 25 years later. We are here where they just reprinted yet another edition of Superman 75. A month ago, Brett and I were at Mexico City for a convention where they did their own really nice, high-quality edition of Superman 75. And when you boil it down to the essence of it all, yeah, there were cool things that happened then, but to be here 25 years later, they aren't doing that for any other books. I mean, we're here and we're talking about it, and it's nice that people remember it and that we were able to impact that many lives.
The other thing, and I'm sure Dan's experience is the same as mine, is the number of people that come up to me at appearances and say, this was the book, the first comic book they bought, the first comic book they read, this, or got them back into comics after a while. I mean, it makes me feel very old that it's been that long, but it's so satisfying that people discovered, well, because there's a lot of negativity. The press at the time was, oh, you did this and blah, blah, blah. But the fans, really it had an impact, and it brought readership in, and it still means 25 years later to these people that are holding on to these copies. These aren't fresh printed copies. They're showing up with unopened bag books they've kept for 25 years, waiting to get a signature or whatever, because it meant something to them. And it's very humbling, and flattering that it had that kind of an impact. It meant that much to people.
Well, I'm sure you've heard it a million times, but thank you again for making these books. It's just phenomenal. It's amazing. Guys, give it up one more time.
Thank you.
Dan Jurgens, Brett Bredding.